When we consider the dangers of service in the defense of one's country, we tend to focus on the risks service personnel can expect to encounter in combat. And so it's easy to forget that military life in general can be a hazardous occupation even in peacetime. This is especially true when it involves new weapon systems that are still maturing and their operational doctrines still being worked out, often by those using them on the job. Today, submarines are highly efficient, ruthlessly effective weapon platforms, particularly in the advanced designs of the world's top-tier naval powers. But this evolution didn't happen overnight, and the early years of submarine operations especially were highly dangerous. The early submarines were so primitive that they were often operated like torpedo and gunboats, only diving when it was necessary to sneak up on an enemy or escape a counterattack. And in that tradition, submariners still refer to their vessels as boats. However, it wasn't their lack of capability compared to later submarines that made the early types as dangerous to their crews as they were to the enemy. Rather, it was a combination of unproven technologies being thrust into an operational world where admirals were still trying to decide how best to use them. It was a hard lesson for many a navy to learn, until finally, by the time of the submarine's greatest conflict, the Second World War, the submarine became an indispensable part of the entire war effort. In this special episode, we're going to examine the tragic tale of the crew of one submarine, the USS S-4, and how the loss of its crew went a long way to improving safety amongst the members of the US Navy's silent service. Welcome to Wars of the World. By the time the United States of America threw its weight behind the fight against the Kaiser in Europe on April 6, 1917, the American people, and indeed the world, was already well aware of the power of the submarine. For barely a fraction of the cost of a battleship, the submarine was an awesomely powerful weapon that could, if used effectively, deny an enemy the use of the sea, which in turn would have a massively detrimental effect on the war on land, as armies were starved of their supplies. The US Navy was one of the pioneers of submarine warfare, conducting the first ever submarine attack, albeit unsuccessfully, during the American Revolutionary War against the British warship HMS Eagle in New York Harbor on September 7, 1776. Then, almost a century later, during the US Civil War, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley attacked and sank the Federal warship USS Housatonic off the coast of South Carolina on February 17, 1864. However, the term successful is a relative one, since the sub was also lost in the incident. By the dawn of the 20th century, however, America's lead in this new type of warfare had been eroded by the European powers, particularly Germany. As such, by the time America declared war, it possessed a fleet of small coastal submarines that lacked the range to conduct the kinds of operations British and German subs were now engaged in, leaving them confined primarily to protecting American ports from enemy attack. Needing to catch up quickly, the US Navy requested that American manufacturers submit proposals for a new class of submarine based on a specification that could match the German types and would be designated the S-class. Two proposals, one from the Lake Torpedo Boat Company in Connecticut and one from the Electric Boat Company in New Jersey, were accepted to proceed to the prototype stage. However, these were joined by a third prototype, designed by the Navy's own Bureau of Construction and Repair. Ultimately, the proposal from Lake was rejected, while the remaining two from Electric and the Navy designers were ordered into production, becoming Groups 1 and 2 of the S-class respectively. As a consolation prize, Lake was given a contract to manufacture the winning vessels, while its one prototype served in a variety of roles for the Navy until 1929. Electric's design was 219 feet 3 inches long, 20 feet 9 inches wide, and had a draft of 16 feet. The type was designed with two 600 horsepower diesel engines to power it on the surface, and had bunkerage for 168 tons of fuel, switching to its electric motors while submerging. The diesel engines gave the class a speed of around 14.5 knots, which disappointed the US Navy, as this was too slow to keep up with fleet operations as they were intended. However, with a range of 5,000 miles on the surface, they were still the service's first ocean-going type, allowing the Navy to gain valuable experience conducting long-range patrols, which could then be implemented in the next class. Armament comprised of 4 forward-firing 21-inch torpedo tubes, with 12 weapons comprising the standard loadout. These were backed up with a single 4-inch deck gun for use on the surface, as well as positions for 50 caliber machine guns. These figures were generally improved upon in the next group, designed and built by the Bureau of Construction and Repair. These Group 2 boats were slightly larger, had more powerful engines to push them over 15 knots, and eventually added a single torpedo tube in the stern for firing at vessels in pursuit. First to be commissioned into service by the Navy was their own prototype, the USS S-4, which joined the fleet on January 30th, 1919, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, and 51 examples across 4 groups would be completed before production ceased in 1925. Collectively, these boats were often referred to as the sugar boats, this being in reference to the US Navy practice of the time of using the word sugar for the letter S in their phonetic alphabet. While advanced designs for their time, it would not be long before the dangers of early submarine operations were felt amongst the fleet. Just over a year and a half after the S-4 entered service, the S-5 was conducting full-power trials approximately 55 miles off Delaware Bay when it began to dive, and to the crew's horror, they suddenly found water pouring inside the hull through the main air induction system which had been left open by mistake, filling the control room, engine room, and torpedo room with seawater. While the flooding was eventually contained, the submarine had taken on so much water that it sank 180 feet to the bottom. Eventually, the crew came up with a desperate plan to blow the stern ballast tanks, causing the rear of the boat to rise upwards, forcing the water forwards and increasing buoyancy in the stern, causing the sub to surface like a cork. The plan worked, and the crew were able to escape. However, attempts to salvage the brand new sub failed. A year later, an almost reverse of the S-5 incident occurred when the S-48 sank on December 7, 1921, during trials prior to commissioning. In this instance, the submarine sank stern first, and only being in 80 feet of water, the bow was not far from the surface, and so the crew on board managed to raise it just above the waterline before escaping via the torpedo tubes. Given the level of danger, this kind of luck for the men on board the S-class boats couldn't hold out forever, and it ran out on the night of September 25, 1925. The boat in question was the S-51, under the command of Lieutenant Rodney Dobson, and which was cruising on the surface near Block Island, south of Newport, Rhode Island. Shortly after 2200 hours, the lookouts on the bridge of the S-51 spotted the lights of the steamship City of Rome off in the distance. Under maritime law, the City of Rome, which was on their port side, should have given way to the S-51 by passing astern of the submarine. But this did not happen, and the steamship continued onwards, oblivious of the danger. Dobson ordered the rudder to hard right, but it was too late, as the City of Rome, now aware of the danger, had also attempted to take evasive action, but in doing so negated Dobson's own efforts, and the ship struck the submarine's battery compartment, slashing the hull and sending seawater flooding in. The submarine sank so quickly that only 3 men were able to escape, helpless as their submarine and 33 of their comrades disappeared below the waves. The investigation put blame primarily on the steamship, but also laid some of the blame on the US Navy regarding the lighting of submarines on the surface. The sinking of S-51 also reignited the question of submarine safety and what steps the US Navy could take to rescue any sailors trapped in their submarines stuck on the bottom. Research was carried out and predominantly focused on improving deep-sea diving techniques to reach stricken submarines and attempts to put lines on them to pull them up. But this was anything but an exacting science by the time a true test came 2 years later with another S-class boat. Launched on August 7th, 1919, and commissioned on November 19th of that year, the S-4 had put its ocean-going performance to good use in the early 1920s, making visits to Cuba and conducting operations in the Gulf of Mexico. This was then followed by what was, at the time, the longest cruise undertaken by American submarines, when in 1921 it was part of a small fleet of subs assigned as part of Flotilla 3 of the Asiatic Fleet based in the Philippines. This required the S-4 to sail down the east coast of the United States and into Central America, transiting through the Panama Canal before sailing on to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, some 4,700 miles away, and then finally arriving at its new base in Manila Bay. After having served in the Philippines, the sub was then reassigned to the US West Coast and then to the Panama Canal Zone before being sent back to the East Coast in early 1927. For the rest of the year, S-4 ran patrols and conducted training predominantly off the coast of New England. On the afternoon of December 17th, 1927, USS S-4, under the captaincy of Lieutenant Commander Roy H. Jones, was running submerged just off the coast of Provincetown, Massachusetts. Having just completed an extensive refit in port, the submarine was undertaking speed and maneuverability tests using 2 white buoys that marked the beginning and end of 1 nautical mile as references. While these tests were going on, up on the surface and near the S-4's position was the Coast Guard destroyer USCGC Paulding, headed in a southeasterly direction in pursuit of rum runners attempting to smuggle alcohol into Boston, this being the era of prohibition in the United States. To cast as wide a net as possible, the old destroyer, a handover from the US Navy, was making a fairly high cruise speed of 18 knots when at 1,537 hours, a lookout on the bridge saw the small wake of a periscope pushing through the water on their port bow, cutting in front of them. The officer of the deck commanding the ship at the time realized a collision was imminent and sprang into action, ordering the ship's engines to be reversed and the rudder to be turned fully to the right, hoping to pass behind the submarine. But it was no good. The Paulding plowed into the sub, punching one hole in a ballast tank and another in the pressure hull, sending freezing water surging into the boat. Within minutes, the S-4 had begun to heel over to port before starting a death dive to the ocean floor, some 110 feet below. The crew scrambled to bring the situation under some kind of control as water flooded the battery compartment, but despite their best efforts, it was a hopeless endeavor, and so they retreated into the control room before sealing up the hatch behind them, but water was still leaking in. The flooding had split the crew into 2 groups, with 6 of the 40-man crew trapped in the torpedo room, while the rest of the crew were spread out on the other side of the submarine, in the control and engine compartments. For the larger group, the situation seemed most bleak, as they realized it was only a matter of time before they would have to abandon the control room as it flooded, forcing them into ever smaller spaces as they retreated aft. Eventually, the seawater shorted out the electronics, plunging the submarine's interior into total darkness. But this was the least of their worries, for the seawater had mixed with the huge batteries, resulting in the creation of chlorine gas. This, coupled with the lack of recirculated air, meant that slowly, each of them was suffocating to death. Back above the surface, the crew of the Paulding had marked the location of the impact with a buoy, and then spent the evening and night searching for any survivors who may have escaped the collision. However, all they found was an oil slick. News of the collision sent the Navy's rescue teams rushing to Provincetown, and the next morning, at 800 hours, the submarine rescue ship USS Falcon picked up 10 divers trained in undersea rescue before racing to the position of the collision. Arriving on the scene at 1100 hours, they found that the Coast Guard had already managed to hook a line on the sunken sub for divers to follow, and so when diver Thomas Eady was lowered into the water, he found the wreck in less than 5 minutes. Edie immediately began tapping on the hull, looking to get a response from the trapped sailors inside, but from the control room aft, there was no response. All 34 men in the aft section of the boat had perished during the night, having suffocated in their vessel, which now served as a steel coffin for their mass grave. However, moving forward, the rescuer was elated to get a response from the torpedo room, indicating that 6 men cut off from the rest of the crew were still alive, and it was now a race against time to rescue them. The 6 men, the most senior of which was 25-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Graham Fitch, had spent a terrifying night huddled up in the torpedo room, trying to do as little as possible so as to minimize their oxygen consumption, wondering if anyone would ever come to rescue them. Their prayers for rescue were not only answered by Edie's taps on the hull, but shortly afterwards by another S-class submarine, the S-8, which, having arrived on the scene, began using its oscillator to ping Morse code messages to them, which they answered by banging on the hull. Using the oscillator, the rescuers, under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Bumby, attempted to ascertain the situation in the torpedo room. The S-8 transmitted, "Is there any gas down there?" To which the men replied, "No, but the air is very bad. How long will you be?" To this question, the rescuers refused to give a definite answer, in case it gave the men false hope, and in their celebration, they consumed more oxygen. In the meantime, another diver, Fred Michaels, was lowered down from the USS Falcon with an air hose that he was going to have to attempt to connect to the sub and feed in fresh air for the men to breathe. Unfortunately, the weather had taken a turn for the worse and was seriously hampering the efforts of the men on the surface. Then, at 20:45 hours, they received a message from Michaels that his own air hose had fouled and he was losing oxygen. And so Edie, despite being exhausted from his own dive, went down again, rescuing the nearly dead Michaels, but in the process losing the hose that was supposed to be fitted to the S-4. With the weather worsening, the Falcon was forced to turn for Boston, leaving S-8 on the scene to keep in contact with the trapped submariners. In the face of the seemingly deteriorating situation, it was clear that the 6 men were beginning to give in to despair when a message was tapped out asking, "Is there any hope?" To which the S-8 replied, "There is hope. Everything possible is being done." Later, the S-8 relayed a message on behalf of Lieutenant Fitch's family, which said, "Lieutenant Fitch, your wife and mother are constantly praying for you." There was no reply. The message was repeated, and again, there was no reply. It wouldn't be until the following morning, after repeating the message all through the night, that at 620 hours a response was heard, which simply said, "I understand." Presumably the men had lost consciousness during the night through exhaustion, or more likely a lack of oxygen, but either way, these were the last words that the world would receive from the men aboard the S-4. Very soon it became clear that the 6 survivors of the collision had joined their comrades. 48 hours after their last message, divers were able to collect a sample of the air from within the torpedo room and found the carbon dioxide levels too high to support life, ending all hope of a last-minute miracle, although it would not be until the day before Christmas Eve that the Navy reported they considered the entire crew as having been killed. In March of 1928, an effort was undertaken to raise the intact submarine that saw divers affix large pontoons to the hull, finally bringing it up to the surface on March 17th, after 3 months on the ocean floor. During that time, divers had recovered 32 of the crew and brought them to the surface to be returned to their families for burial. Lieutenant Fitch's body was found underneath a workbench in the torpedo room, next to 2 large patches of peeled-off paint on the wall, these being the spots where he had tapped out his messages to S-8, while S-4's captain, Lieutenant Commander Roy H. Jones, was found near a set of steps in the rear of the submarine, indicating he had been standing until overcome by the poisonous gas. The divers, who were used to seeing dead bodies in all manner of ghastly situations, nevertheless found themselves deeply affected by one sight in particular, as they recovered men from the aft compartments. 2 enlisted men who were good friends spent their last moments clasped in each other's arms, trying to find the most minute feeling of comfort in the embrace. So moved by the spectacle, the divers agreed to try and bring them up together, but found they could not get them out of the submarine through the opened hatch, and so were forced to separate them for their final journey to the surface. For his bravery in rescuing Michaels after he got into trouble, Thomas Edey would receive the Medal of Honor. The citation for the medal read, "For display of extraordinary heroism in the line of his profession above and beyond the call of duty on the 18th of December 1927, during the diving operations in connection with the sinking of the USS S-4. After being towed to Boston, the submarine was decommissioned, but was overall in too good a condition to be scrapped, and so was repaired and returned to service as a test boat. In this regard, there could be no more fitting a tribute to those who lost their lives aboard the submarine than to have the submarine used in extensive testing of new rescue methods for trapped submariners. This led to the creation of a specialist diving bell, known as the McCann Rescue Chamber, itself being constructed from a section of a decommissioned submarine. Operating off Key West, Florida, the Navy practiced docking the chamber with S-4 at depths up to 300 feet, almost 3 times as deep as where the S-4 had sunk. Using this diving bell and an emergency breathing device known as a Momsen lung, sailors were able to escape repeatedly from the sunken submarine, meaning that for those who followed in the US Navy's silent service, who might find themselves in a similar predicament as Graham Fitch and the rest of the crew of the S-4, there was, at least, hope.